Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Folks will probably keep streaming in here. I think the hotel, you've got some nooks and crannies to figure out to get to the room. So we're very excited to host a session this afternoon on college promise programs built for completion. We have a star-studded panel of, essentially what happened is I wanted to create a panel that had these people on it. And so we just kind of worked it out perfectly like that. So we have Martha Kanter from College Promise Campaign, Krissy DeAlejandro from tnAchieves, and Mackenzie Higgins from the Mayor's Office in Indianapolis. So I want to start with just having each of you kind of give a little bit of an overview of the work you're doing and kind of how this all plays together. Let's start with you, Martha.
Okay, I'll just start with a few slides just by way of background. I've spent a lot of years trying to understand what is the role and what can we do to get more students completing college. So that's sort of the backdrop for College Promise. Don't make a promise you can't keep, and make a promise that has a goal that is ambitious. And it's really hard to do. So I don't want to underestimate. He's showing me how to click this. Okay, thank you. So, I called this, I'll just do a few slides and then turn this over to Krissy. But I spent 5 years as your undersecretary, and after that I went to NYU and I did a deep dive into College Promise, children's savings, and behavioral incentives. And the idea was, could there be some combination of financial sustainability and support for students more than state and federal aid? Could there be the right design incentives matched with interventions that the faculty would lead on, the staff would lead on at the local campuses, and in the wider community? Is there an untapped resource in the wider community to help us address those behavioral incentives and interventions? And third, could children's savings, could we even have a vision later on, because these things take time? So many promise programs at the time I looked at this, there were about 53. There was one state, Tennessee, which we had known and worked with, since the early part of 2010, 11, 12. But could we grow this, and could we understand that if you make a promise, could that be given to younger and younger students and to their families, so that families would understand that they would have the opportunity? So with that, you always have to have a reason for doing things. And the reasons have grown, I think when I look back over more than a decade, these reasons are all kinds of reasons. You can use these slides. I think we are going to show these slides and make them available to you. But we're behind in college completion, bottom line. We don't have the kind of vibrant, prosperous, growing cities, especially in rural America. I'm glad to see Kate Mahar here from northern California, who's really doing a promise in the northernmost part of California. And we don't have the kind of equity, and that's going to be one of our challenges. We need to close those equity gaps, whether it's on the achievement side or on the social mobility side or the income side. You can look at all those things. So I could spend a lot of time on this, but I will say that College Promise is not new. High school is an expectation for everyone in the country. It's a right. You're going to graduate from high school, but today you're going to have to go beyond. And I think we need to make the case to everyone, as we did more than 30, 40 years ago. Rice University, a private institution in Texas, was free until the 1960s. We did this through the GI Bill. SUNY and CUNY were free until the 60s and 70s and 80s. Same for California, same for a lot of parts of the country where our families could afford college, but today it's a real challenge. So what's happened in 3 years since we started the campaign? We started it as what we're calling a nonpartisan effort. We have a Republican governor and Dr. Jill Biden, who's a Democrat, leading it together. They've done it for 3 years. They've just signed on for 3 more years. When you look across the country now at 300 programs in local communities, the newest of which I think is almost, tnAchieves, but I think there's one more that just came on board, right, after tnAchieves? Yeah, I think maybe you're the second to latest. But there are more than 300, and from one state to more than 23. And we just finished a whole webinar with governors and a symposium last week, and we have 3 more states that are ready to go, which include Virginia, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So we'll have more than half the states thinking about this, trying to do something, and we want to move it forward. So what is a promise? As I said in the beginning, it's going to be more than tuition. It's going to provide mentoring and other supports that my colleagues will tell you about. And it's a promise to help students and families not be so burdened with debt. You hear a lot about federal debt. We don't say anything about credit card debt or other forms of debt. And we want families to be able to purchase a home, get a car, get a good job, live successfully in the community. And, you know, can we start somewhere? Can we start with community colleges? In New York, they started with both 2- and 4-year. Every state's going to be different. Every local community will be different. But we've got to start somewhere and grow a promise that's going to be kept. These are some of the features. I think we'll talk about that in a minute, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. But we want this sustainability and stability. Those are the 2 words that I really use. Can we create a design that is going to be something people will ascribe to and champion? Can it guarantee support? Can it really be led not just by the education folks or by the business folks or by the government folks, but by a combination? And so what have we found? The models are going to vary. Every community is different, every state is different, the populations are different, the types of supports are different, but it's a great opportunity to learn from the best practices. And we've got to really get that collaborative leadership that we want. Here are just some of the partners. You see CCA in the middle. We published a paper last spring with Blake's leadership called Promise with a Purpose. I think it really speaks to don't do a promise unless you have a goal that's reasonable, you have the buy-in, and you also want to have more people succeeding in your communities. Looking at the outcomes, here's just a smattering of different outcomes, and this is going to be one of the goals for the next couple years on the campaign. Can we learn from the best where the greatest impacts are? So you'll see whether it's a state or a local community, these are the kinds of impacts we want to see. We want to see impacts in not only enrollment, but completion. We're here about completion. We want to see impacts in mentoring, in community service, and other ways that we're really engaging students to put forth their very best and reach their potential. The movement's growing, as I said. This is my last slide. It's really a look ahead. But what are we going to do in the campaign? We're going to look at the best practices so that Promise programs can really use them. Can we do a paper, which we will be doing, on the value proposition? Because it's not without its criticisms, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And can we identify where the quality is occurring, where the impacts are, and really grow those and help more Promise programs take advantage of what's being learned. So that's what I wanted to share this morning, and I'll turn this over to Krissy.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We're going this way? Martha, you have another slide.
No,
you want to talk about it?
No.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's so fun to be with you this afternoon, especially to sit next to Martha, who I was just with last week. I think we're together weekly now, which is super fun for me. And then also to share the conversation with Blake and Mackenzie, who I've been working with for a couple of years as well. So thank you for having me. So just a brief overview. I think oftentimes when we talk about Tennessee Promise, it does feel somewhat like Tennessee Promise was an overnight success. And I always tell groups it was an overnight success that actually took 6 years to build. We started small in one community, Knox County. The idea was to eliminate the barriers keeping our students from entering the post-secondary pipeline and ultimately earning some type of post-secondary credential. What we found is that while the funding was important, I always say it's the carrot that brings students and families to us. The infrastructure we found to be the difference maker in moving the needle for at-risk student populations. It's my favorite part of the program to walk into a cafeteria or an auditorium of 500 students and parents and say, you're here and college is free. And then you build all the scaffolding around that free college for the student. It's a very different conversation than, oh, by the way, if you complete what can be a nightmare called the FAFSA, you may in fact receive some aid that could help you go to and earn a college degree. So for us, we built a last dollar scholarship, understanding that in the early years of the Knox Achieves that became Tennessee Achieves, we were asking private donors to cover the last dollar scholarship. Now, Tennessee Promise, that launched in 2014 with the 15 cohort of high school seniors, it is excess lottery dollars that have been placed into an endowment, which was really brilliant on behalf of our governor, Governor Haslam, who is an incredible champion, not only for our program, but also for higher education in general. But it was brilliant because we can now say to the kindergartner, college is your destiny. We're not scrambling to find funding. We're not sure if we can pay for this class or that class. We're certain that this program has sustainability well beyond Governor Haslam, and certainly now is his legacy. It was also really important to our donors in the beginning that our students had some skin in the game. The chairman of our board is forever a Boy Scout. So he really wanted to cultivate a culture of giving back with our students, which materialized into an 8-hour per semester community service component. I will tell you, as of today, we crossed the 2 million hours given back by our student mark. The deadline was yesterday. And so it's really fun for me to think about all the good work that students are doing in their communities, but also that this is a job shadowing opportunity. Our big businesses like FedEx, like Eastman Chemical, like Caterpillar Financial open their doors so that students can decide if in fact this is a career they would like to pursue. So exposure being so important for our students. And then finally, the heart of our program, what we knew is that particularly for first generation students, again, that support and encouragement could make all the difference in the world when they were making the decision to go to college. Our mentoring program is not Big Brothers Big Sisters. That's an amazing program in its own right. But we ask CEOs and CFOs and all sorts of business community type leaders to step up so that they can encourage students as they transition from high school into college. I will tell you, Friday was the deadline for the 19 cohort of mentors, and we recruited 9,465 volunteers to serve a record number of 64,000 students in our state. So again, every year Tennessee's setting big goals, but our state really stepping up. And I think the most important part to really think about is the alignment piece that has happened around Tennessee Promise, but also this sort of grassroots. So while we have the governor as a champion, it is also very much rooted in communities and locally owned, which helps with the sustainability component. I always steal my own thunder in the space of slides. I just sort of continue to tell the story, but you can see here our volunteer mentoring component, again, so critical to the work we do. I should say, what is tnAchieves and what is Tennessee Promise? So we were the model for Tennessee Promise, and when Promise was launched, we now operate as the partnering organization to Promise, so we continue to serve as a 501c3 nonprofit in partnership with the state. We are tasked every year with recruiting and training and retaining our volunteer mentors, and year after year, as I said, our citizens are stepping up in such a big way to be a resource for students. I will tell you, I've had so many conversations about what's a credit hour. Students will not go to college because they don't know what a credit hour is, and they believe they're the only student on that campus who doesn't know. Again, talking about growth, 493 students the first year of the program. I've been there since it was an idea on a whiteboard. I knew all 493 students and all their mamas that first year. It gets a little more difficult when you have 64,000 students, and that's why the volunteer mentoring component becomes more and more important to the work that we do. You can also see the first year of Promise, that's the huge jump between 14 and 15. And what's been really interesting watching Martha's program grow over the years is I do believe that many states feel like they have to go big initially. And what we say is we started small and we learned a lot in those first years about how to operate a program. And we also measured everything that we did. So when we did introduce the Promise program statewide, we had 6 years of data to actually talk about the kind of work and the kind of movement we had seen across Tennessee. Very quickly, I'll run through slides and happy to continue this conversation, but you can see we've had a giant increase in our state's FAFSA file rate, beginning with about a 72% FAFSA file rate, and this year we had an 86% FAFSA file rate. Again, Cannot say enough about alignment here. This is higher ed and K-12 and community partners all making sure in a very targeted, specific way that every student has the opportunity to complete the FAFSA. We also saw the first year of Promise a 4.6% increase in our state's college going rate, which represents more than the last 7 years combined in Tennessee. I often hear Governor Haslam talk about this jump as an idea of shocking the system, and we have continued to sustain that college going rate year after year. We're also retaining and completing students who are part of the program well above state and national averages. We're seeing significant increases in both retention and completion. And for me, the most important component is, are we closing those equity gaps? Are we serving low-income students? And you will see here, since we launched the program, 5,000 more low-income students in the pipeline, and now our students that are coming from more low-income backgrounds are 17 percentage points more likely to go to post-secondary. You can also see the breakdown by race and ethnicity as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Mackenzie, who will talk to you about tnAchieves.
So as you can see from the name, we have stolen a lot of our program from the two that we've talked about. And so I'm going to walk through what the process was, what requirements and choices we made in that.
Can I just really quickly say, when we were sitting in Indianapolis trying to come up with the name, they gave us a bunch of different options. We worked with a marketing firm to come up with those options, and Mackenzie and I got on the phone and said we should just call it tnAchieves. This was a futile exercise because it's what it really is.
Yes, it ended up sticking. So why Mayor Hogsett knew that we needed in Indianapolis something like this is because, like many places in the country, there is a misalignment between available jobs and credentialed individuals to have those jobs. And so we know to remain competitive in the 21st century economy and grow as a city, that we're going to have to invest in our talent and invest in our people. And there's kind of three buckets of how you grow your educational attainment. You can invest in your K-12 students that are accessing and completing post-secondary credentials and degrees. You can skill up your existing adult population, and you can attract new residents with the requisite credentials. tnAchieves focuses on those first two buckets, investing in our existing residents, both K-12 students and adults. And our mission is, very well aligned. And so by 2027, 65% attainment rate in Indianapolis, up from 42%, and eliminate attainment gaps from our Black and Latino residents. And so there is a big policy book online at tnAchieves.org. The running joke in the mayor's office is I'm never going to be allowed to write a report again, especially not with Blake's help with the policy development because we're a little windy. But so if you want additional information, you can go there. But really, the program is based on how do we ensure more students are accessing higher ed, but then once they get there, how do we ensure they're pursuing the right degrees, they're completing on time, and then they're plugged in to the existing career networks that are available in Indianapolis. And so we're going to do that by maximizing our state and federal programs. Indiana, we have somebody from the Commission for Higher Ed here, so happy to see Sean. But we've had a longstanding program, 21st Century Scholars, that provides tuition and fees support for low-income students. And so what we found actually is that our students are accessing higher ed at a higher rate than average, or low-income students. But then once they get to higher ed, their persistence, retention, and on-time graduation rates just really decline. That flips, and they're really falling behind their peers. And so we want to build off existing state and federal programs, make sure we're not duplicating efforts, and provide a last dollar promise scholarship if there is a remaining gap. But probably more importantly, we want to create success-centered eligibility requirements to ensure students are setting themselves up for success, and that the higher education institutions that we're partnering with are implementing high-impact practices so students are able to meet those requirements. And then the last piece is ensuring that students are able to make informed choices about their career options in Indianapolis, so improving advising to reflect local market activity. And so I'm going to talk here about what some of those success eligibility requirements are, and how how we're going to measure our success. It's going to be critical that at every point in the way that tnAchieves can prove its value add, and that we can adjust our implementation strategies if it proves that we're not getting the anticipated results. So how we are going to measure improved access is by increasing the number of 8th graders enrolling in 21st Century Scholars, and then increasing the rate of high school seniors completing their FAFSA on time. The more exciting to me piece is the completion side and our goal to increase persistence. And so for tnAchieves students, we want them to declare a major pathway in their first year. We want them to enroll in 9 credit hours in their program of study in that first year. On an annual basis, we want to ensure they're enrolling in 30 credit hours and completing Gateway Math and English. And all of these things that I'm rattling off are things that Complete College America and others have shown that are proven to move the needle in persistence. And so we're baking them in to our eligibility requirements for students. But we don't want to discount the fact that the higher ed institutions have a role to play in that, right? And so they need to come alongside as partners, which they have, and ensure that they are making the reforms necessary that those eligibility requirements are meaningful. So what I mean by that is, if a student takes 30 credit hours, but they didn't have courses offered that were sequenced to their degree, the 30 credit hours are kind of irrelevant, right? The whole point is that they're on track and pursuing their degree. And so that takes the higher ed institutions have a responsibility in this agreement as well. And then the last piece, which I haven't talked a ton about, but I think is pretty unique, is the dollars will go to a last dollar promise, but at least initially, bigger investment is going to be in completion grants. These are modeled off Georgia State's retention grant program, and target the students that are near completion, but maybe had some emergency situation and can't pay their tuition bill anymore, and now they drop out. And this is where our employers have gotten really, really excited. It's hard in an ever-changing economy and labor market to convince employers to invest in 8th graders that if everything goes perfect, it'll be a decade before they're in the labor market. But it's really easy to convince them to make investments when you can say, and in 6 months, this person could be out and could be working for your company. And our ultimate outcome is to increase on-time graduation rates at our partner institutions. The partnership is something I'm really proud of, and what the mayor is really proud of. It's between the city of Indianapolis, Employ Indy, who's our state workforce board, Ivy Tech Community College, and IEPY, which is our local 4-year institution. So this program is open to individuals pursuing certificates, 2-year degrees and 4-year degrees, and will be administered. It was really important there was long-term sustainability for this, which means it needed to move outside of the mayor's office to ensure that, past the mayor's time, that it's still there. And so Employ Indy will serve as a fiscal administrator of it. They'll do kind of similar to how tnAchieves comes alongside the promise. They will do all of the mentorship components. They will ensure they're monitoring student progress and success, and that they're holding the higher ed institutions accountable. Higher ed institutions will agree to share student data, implement the best practices I mentioned before. And there's, again, a whole laundry list of best practice that's online, tnAchieves.org.
I couldn't work for CCA if I didn't say that one of the big ones is that the institutions have agreed to do remediation as a co-requisite. As we were working through the process, that was kind of a non-negotiable, that we recognized we were losing way too many students if they were placed in traditional sequences. So that became a big part of the work as well.
And the second piece I think is really relevant is this is open to adults, and so our higher IEPY doesn't do a ton with structured scheduling. It's like many traditional 4-year institutions where you enroll for the classes that are available. And so we're working with them to really meet adult students where they're at, who oftentimes have to have a full-time work schedule. And so how can we create selective majors and sequencing so that they have structured schedules, and it makes it a little bit more accessible to have adults return to a 4-year degree, which is Ivy Tech has done a great job recently in trying to make those strides and make it accessible for adults. And so we want the same at the 4-year institution. And so that brings me to funding. I implied this a little bit when I was talking about the partnership, but it's not just an implementation partnership, but it's also a financial partnership. The city has agreed, has included in the 2019 budget passed by council a $2 million appropriation for the scholarships and grants. Those will be administered via Employee Indy and the bursar's offices at the higher ed institutions. And it's 1.5 because 500,000 will be going into a reserve to ensure there's a backstop to the promise for years to come. And the interesting piece is for every completion grant awarded, the higher ed institutions have agreed to pay Employee Indy a fee for that, for keeping those students enrolled for an additional semester. And that's what covers operating expenses. And so the city is investing in scholarships and grants directly to students, being administered by the workforce board, and the higher ed institutions are agreeing that if that work is successful, that they will cover the operating expenses, which is why proving our value add is so critical. And so we're just getting off the ground. Our first cohort will enroll in fall of 2019. So it's a sprint for the next 6 months, but we're really excited to see our outcomes.
Great. So I hope you all recognize how exciting this is to see the way this has kind of evolved. And Martha, you've been doing this for a long time. Krissy's been doing this for a long time. We're building off of the great things that are happening in cities around the country as well. You've all kind of mentioned partnerships, but if you could maybe dive a little deeper into how important building partnerships is in kind of developing these programs, what you're seeing across the country, and I think either of you would just share as well.
Sure. I mean, I can jump in and just say the promise is a great idea. And so if I look at all 300, which we look at all the time, and you look at their evolution, sometimes a community college started the promise. It was a president who read about Kalamazoo, and maybe 5-6 years ago, we have someone, Mike Flores, who's the new chancellor in San Antonio, and he's really excited, but he's been studying Tennessee for a long time. And so sometimes it'll happen there. Sometimes it'll happen at a university. I was at the Central Valley Promise in California, and the state university president was talking with United Way, and they decided to bring in some of the business leaders and launch a Central Valley Promise. They have 12 high schools, they have 3 community colleges, they have a major state university there, and they were talking with the University of California there as well. So sometimes it can happen from the education standpoint. Other times it may happen from the business leaders. So for example, the Detroit Promise has had its stops and starts over the years, and the last couple of years the Detroit Chamber said, we are going to lead this, we're going to work with education, business, government, and philanthropy. So those are 4 given partners. Sometimes a nonprofit partner can come on board also, but in those cases, the Chamber is actually leading that promise there. Other times it's government. So you're seeing, the mayor reaching out. You just saw Mayor Jenny Durkin just passed a fantastic appropriation that's going to make the promise sustainable for the students in Seattle. So a lot of times, Chris Cabaldon's on our board from West Sacramento. He started the promise early on and involved business, labor, government, and philanthropy, and actually had a sales tax that was going to expire, and the city council unanimously approved the extension without an end date, and they put the promise in there. So there are all kinds of ways that this happens, but it's just not one partner. And the one thing they share in common is to bring the other partners to the table, and I think you saw that in what Mackenzie just put up. Who's leading it, who's managing the money, who decides on the mentors. Do the nonprofit providers like United Way come in and help with the mentoring and other kinds of ways that student supports happen, even Boys and Girls Clubs that Krissy mentioned. So it really is a panoply of leaders, but the fact is they come to the table together. I know in the Long Beach Promise, the mayor, the university president, the community college president, and a business leader meet at a table every single week. And so those are the kinds of commitments that you want to see. Every community is going to be different. Every state will be different. The amount of time the executives have to actually sit at the table is going to vary. And I think that's one thing about the Promise programs. There has to be some flexibility. So I do want to say I'm hoping that the state leaders will understand how to incentivize local flexibility. because there needs to be that level of achievement. And we actually, I think a lesson learned is we've got a lot of bureaucracies to get through, and we don't want to sort of burden the Promise programs any more than they are already encumbered by doing this kind of work. So let me stop there. I don't know, Krissy.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think it's the champion who catalyzes the work, but it's the partnerships that sustain the work. And so for us, starting small, it was the mayor's office, much like Mackenzie's role. I was in a similar role in the mayor's office, and we had in Knoxville a city mayor and a county mayor. And those guys approached a business guy to say, we have this big idea, but we really want to bring business and industry to the table. And I was in the meeting, and I will tell you that Randy Boyd, the business guy, he has the patent for the invisible fence, left the meeting and then called me about 30 minutes later and said, I might need to see your resume because I've raised $2.3 million in cash and pledges. I don't think it happens in 30 minutes for everyone, but that's how it happened for us. And we had about 2 months to get a program off the ground. And so one of those mayors then became governor. And so what was so important when Governor Haslam said, this is what we're doing across the state, is he really solidified that we had a champion. That bully pulpit, the messaging around not if college was an option, but where you're going to college started to be the conversation in Tennessee. But I will tell you that every Monday we send out from tnAchieves a weekly email, and this is sort of where our students are in the Promise process. And there are over 200,000 people on that email. It's chamber presidents, it's college presidents, it's financial aid officers, it's K-12 counselors. And so finding the champion, we exist in 83 counties, is really county specific for us, selfishly because I need to recruit mentors for our students, but also to make sure that the work is grounded. What works in Memphis does not work in rural pockets of East Tennessee, and we're very aware of that after 11 years of work. And so if we want to do work well, then we have to find not only that champion, but I think, again, the partnership to really ground the work and make sure that it sustains.
Yeah, as we were launching this in Indianapolis, the mayor commissioned a task force. It was made up of many of the individuals that you speak of. It was nonprofit leadership, philanthropic leadership. It was business leaders, government officials at the state and local level. It was co-chaired. In Indianapolis, we have a spirit and a history of collaboration. We also are blessed to have some really important higher ed partners, and so Complete College America is located there, so it was co-chaired by Blake, and then Lumina Foundation, Haley Glover represented them, and so they really led us through and helped us craft and do the data dive of, okay, what are you trying to accomplish? What's a specific challenge? And so we were really able to marry perspective of business leader with the community college and reality on the ground with the data of our community and say, okay, here are where the gaps are. And it was really pertinent for that task force that we not duplicate any existing efforts, but we essentially, our tnAchieves should be the thread that connects ongoing efforts and is able to be the on-the-ground voice for these state efforts and really provide that local context in recruiting students into state programs, ensuring that their needs are met at the specific campuses that we have partnered with. And so it was really important. It really helped with buy-in from the higher ed institutions to have them at the table from day one all the way through. And it really became a team effort of how do we get this across the finish line and do what's best for Indianapolis and do what's best for students in getting outcomes and improving quality of life, social mobility, all of the kind of equity concerns that are top of mind in Indy right now.
So Promise programs haven't gone without criticism, and I think some that have been raised have been around issues of equity. Do those arguments have merit, or are there places we just need to work a little harder, or what's kind of the take on folks that are kind of standing as a front to programs right now?
Well, I'll just say, looking across the country, the more regulations and the more requirements, the more challenges. But from a local community standpoint, everyone wants the perfect model. And so one of the big criticisms is you're not paying for housing in a Promise. So you can't have that. Or equity, you have achievement gaps. Or another one is, you're just focused on enrollment in this promise, why aren't you tracking outcomes? Because a lot of the promise programs are bringing up their evaluation and research, but they didn't start with it like Krissy's program did. So there are a variety of criticisms. I think I have a list on a slide I can send anyone of, I think there's like 20 criticisms. And it's never going to be enough. And I think what I always say is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Start somewhere. As Krissy said, start small. If you're worried about the money, you haven't raised enough money, you have to go back to the drawing board, or it's not sustainable. Politicians came in and did it because it pulled so high in these races that, you know, they wanted to do something. That's all well and good, but I think we have to be very realistic and hit the criticisms head on and say to people, how can you help us? You know, the achievement gap has been with us far too long, and we all need to work on that and do our part. Where is, you know, if you drill down into some of the data, you see what some of the gaps are. We have too many students that don't have a mentor, for example, or too many first-generation students whose families can't help them. So I think, you know, that's part of sort of unraveling the criticisms. It's very popular to criticize and point fingers and have the rhetoric. The hard work is really on the ground.
I agree. So let's just say this as a caveat, although let's keep it in the room, the business guys who actually allow me to have a job would come for me. But
so we'll turn off the live stream real quick.
Yeah, no one's listening. Yeah, I know. Well, here we go. But, you know, as a low-income first-generation kid that grew up in rural Tennessee, I would love to offer a first dollar scholarship with housing and a dedicated one-to-one mentoring relationship and books and transportation and childcare if you need it. I mean, you could layer and layer and layer, but that's not the reality that we exist in. And so I agree with Martha in the fact that we have to combat these head on to say, we are moving the needle. For example, Tennessee has really dug in on the data to show that we are moving the needle on low-income students, and we are moving the needle on closing the equity gaps. Are we where we want to be? Absolutely not. There's plenty of work to be done in this space. I would argue that rural students have a great disadvantage in Tennessee because oftentimes the local community college is 45 minutes away, and how are we going to tackle that for our students? And so it's continuing to be solutions oriented. I think that's the frustrating part for me as someone who wakes up every day and tries to serve 80,000 plus students across our state, is how can we be solutions oriented, not only pointing out the challenges we have, but really in a reasonable, logical way, trying to break down these barriers in a way that our General Assembly can get behind, in a way that local business can get behind, and so that we're pulling, again, everyone in the same direction, and obviously that direction is for students.
Lots of criticisms in Indianapolis so far, or we've been okay so far?
We've been okay, but we have heard though similar feedback and wanting to be more inclusive, wanting to provide greater promises, greater dollars to support some of the wraparound services needed. And our response to that has been, we know that financial aid and having financial resources is a barrier, right? And we can tackle that piece of the barrier, and we're going to learn as we go what contextualized services our students need in these environments and what then the solutions can be. And so using our students' experience and learning from them as opposed to trying to create a one-size-fits-all promise on the front end before we know the actual needs has been kind of our message, and people have bought into that.
I just want to add one little thing, just use one example in Los Angeles. So Mayor Garcetti, large Los Angeles promise, lots of students, lots of first generation low income students. Los Angeles Valley College is one of, I believe it's 9 community colleges in the Los Angeles area. The county appropriated $800,000 this spring to actually start supporting drop-in childcare at Los Angeles Valley College. Now that didn't happen out of the blue, but it's the kind of thing that the cross-sector partnership does. It brings other people to the table to say, we can fund this legitimately through our appropriation that we have authority for, but it's that social welfare network that actually has connected to Promise to say we could do more. Same thing with children's savings accounts, and you know, you just see all of these sort of cross-pollinated designs that get figured out because people learn more and they say, oh, we can do this part of it, which goes back to your point about being solutions oriented. But I do think, if you're in the promise work and you want to take this on in one way or another, you just have to be open to criticism and really listen and drill down into the criticisms. We do have some states that are first dollar, not last dollar. That's all well and good. For us, it's about the impact. What is it in the design of these different promise programs that's going to produce the greatest completion, the greatest workforce preparedness, and the best citizens that our country desperately needs?
So you've all touched on sustainability a little bit, right? About having the data to show your value. I think about with Tennessee and Indianapolis, at least, you had politicians that kind of stepped up. Now you've been able to sustain for a very long time. What advice for folks that are thinking about these programs and when it comes to sustainability can you offer, right? I mean, I think with Indianapolis we had a mayor and then me on the city council kind of pushing on both sides. But if that's not always the case, how do we ensure these programs don't just become a shiny political object that kind of fades away over the next several years?
Well, I think, again, just returning to the idea of being locally owned and also allowing local communities an outlet to provide feedback. So at least once a year, I travel to all our communities and go through what probably for them is a very boring slide deck. But it is really important to me to show community-based data. So I'm from Warren County, Tennessee, so I'll use that as an example. Warren County, this is where your college going rate was. Here's where we are now. This is how we're doing with your low-income students. Here's how we're doing with your students of color. And it's very transparent. I have nothing to hide in the space of we're either doing really well or we're not, or we're sustaining or we're not. And then saying to them, why are we where we are? You have to tell me so that we can do work more effectively because we have room to grow in every community in Tennessee. And so I think it's allowing the local communities to hold our organization accountable. And I will say this, also the mamas, the parents will hold you accountable as well. I talk to parents still every day on the phone. That's by design. If you go to our website, my phone number is the first one listed, and people think that's insane. But for me, it's about recognizing patterns. If we're not getting something right, if we're not communicating something right, we need to know that so that we can pivot very quickly because the sustainability of this program means sustainability for our citizens and greater economic viability for our state. So we can't get it wrong.
I guess one of these questions I want to ask before we open up for anyone in the audience, if someone is out there and they're saying that we've got to get started on this, this is the next big thing for us, where should they start?
They should start with the problem. What problem are you trying to solve? And how many people can own that problem? And that may sound very simplistic, but everyone has ideas when you say the word promise or when you say the word free. And I always start off, usually in my other speeches, I usually say, nothing's free. But free brings people to the table that don't think it's possible. And so it's been a great stimulant in terms of the communications. But I think people need to be very clear, and it may take time to really figure out, are you trying to solve one problem, lack of completion, low income, first generation, gap, financing, all those pieces. But you have to start with the problem and go from there.
I would argue you also have to have the data, right? I think, and Martha, I know, would back me up on this. If you don't have the data to put in front of people when you are, in fact, trying to get something off the ground or trying to identify the problem, you can't talk at the 30,000-foot level. It is a very tangible, specific. In Tennessee, we started off with the idea of only 32% of our citizens had some type of post-secondary credential, and we knew that by 2025 we needed 55%. So that post-secondary attainment goal was really the driving factor in could we launch a sustainable promise program for our students. And subsequently, and I only know enough about it to be dangerous, but we also have launched an adult promise program called Reconnect through our Higher Education Commission. And it's been an overwhelming success. That team has done a miraculous job in wrapping their arms around what can be a difficult population to figure out.
Yeah, I think having the end outcome in mind and then backwards planning the steps to get there is what's critical. So if your end outcome is the attainment rate, what are the things that need to happen in an intermediate fashion in order to get there, and what are your points to know how you're doing along the way. And I think that, and then look at the best practice. There's tons of literature out there on it. So once you have your problem identified, you'll have lots and lots of resources available to you to kind of craft a nuanced policy that will meet the needs of your individual community.
Like your report.
Like my report, yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
Also, if you have, completion as a goal, which every Promise program pretty much has, be smart about the completion. The criticism will be, you're not counting all the students, or how many students already have baccalaureate degrees that are in a community college that you're counting in the big amount. Who are the students within the population that you really want to get to complete, and then what are the designs and the resources that you're going to apply to that. So I think you have to be smart when you actually start working on data sets to share, because people will come back right away and poke holes in the data.
Yeah, I would also say go, right? We didn't spend any time planning. I'm not necessarily great at planning, and so maybe that was just my own bias in the space, but we just started moving, and we learned along the way, and we made tons of mistakes, all of which I'm happy to share with you so you don't make the same ones. But it is very much let's go, because you can over-research and you can get in your own head about which students and what should the income cap be and all these different components that, again, so much literature and everyone's doing it so differently. I would say just go and learn as you go. I'm very fortunate that I'm governed by entrepreneurs who share that, and so as we've made mistakes, we've just learned from them and continued to move.
And I'll just add credibility that Krissy was always willing to hop on the phone with us and to work through every detail and share every resource. And I think tnAchieves, the success I expect it's going to have, will be a direct result of Krissy's efforts to help us get there. And so that's been pretty extraordinary. I want to open up if there's anyone in the audience here who'd like to ask a couple questions. We have a couple hands, and Henry's going to help us out here and get a microphone over to you without obstructing our live stream.
Hi, I'm Christina Scott from Birmingham, Alabama. And I saw Krissy present 5 or 6 years ago. I think it was at NCAN. And I've been trying to talk about Promise programs in Central Alabama ever since. I now finally have a grant for a feasibility study, because we have 5 counties, we have 30-something school systems. And so I actually have 2 questions, which is, one, I'd love to hear more about Indianapolis. How did you get the community colleges on board with the co-requisite remediation? I also have 4 community colleges that I'm going to be dealing with. And then my second question is, what role did local education foundations play in the beginning of the Tennessee Promise? I recall that you started raising money from Rotary clubs, but we also have an ecosystem of local education foundations, probably because our schools are so poorly funded. And so I'm thinking about how I navigate through that and really think about who the right partners are, the right fiscal partners are in each county.
So we'll start with Mackenzie, the question on institutions.
Yeah, so having them at the table from the beginning and hearing the collective feedback from all of the stakeholders was really important. The second thing was having the carrot and the stick available. And so we were able to say, we're going to fund completion grants at your institutions, and here is the revenue impact of those dollars for you. But we need you to do these things for us, and we're going to help you do them, right? And so we're going to provide you resources and partnerships with those that know how to implement this in best practice, and we're going to connect you with them. We're also going to provide you a small cohort of students to pilot your efforts on, right? So in theory, tnAchieves students are a very small subset of the entire community college network. And so we said, we'll be there right alongside as your partner to help you do this and to test out and figure out exactly what works and what doesn't. So then you can scale it to your entire campus. And so I think by being a partner and being willing to say, you don't have to do it perfect the first time, but you do have to make it accessible to our students for these dollars, and here are the resources to do that, they were able to get on board with that.
Yeah, I'll just add it because I was in a lot of these meetings as well. I think we were really honest and open with one another. I think at the institutional level, Ivy Tech and IUPUI were great partners that were consistently ready to kind of own our challenges, our shared challenges, but be committed to the same kind of vision for the future. That was a really, really powerful thing. And again, we had foundations at the table. We had other partners. We had the commission. Sean was in a lot of these meetings with us. So you kind of had this entire community coming together and saying, we really care about this. And at the end of the day, we also believe that these are the kind of components of this program that could lead to exponentially greater success for our students. And that was, I mean, I think those were some of the most exciting meetings I've ever been a part of, because the conversation was focused on that at the end of the day every single time. And I think that's what's so cool about community approaches, is that if you can get, the United Way and everyone else at the table with you, and you're all kind of committed to the fact that college attainment is the social mobility kind of supercharge, we can kind of fight for those same things. The other question for you.
Sure. So with regard to funding, I mean, we've been so fortunate at tnAchieves to really, for the last 10 years, have the same 12 donors who continue to step up for us year after year, even as we've increased the need because students have grown exponentially. But I would say this, especially with local education foundations, we have a handful, but they're mostly tied to large philanthropists within the city who've started their own education foundation and have decided to also support the work that we do. But find that first champion who will go with you. So without Randy Boyd, we would have raised $0. I was terrible in the fundraising space, but I learned so much in the early days from him. And what he brought to the table, number one, he's just brilliant and savvy, but he also said, I'm in for this amount. Will you join me? Which was a very different conversation from, a 26-year-old kid saying like, hey, we have this big idea to send every kid to college. And so it was a game changer for us as we raised dollars that Randy really solidified. And as we grew from tnAchieves to tnAchieves, I mean, I remember a very specific meeting in Memphis where we brought 50 business leaders to the table, and he said, I'm not only supporting what we're doing in Knoxville, but I'm also throwing in a large amount of money to support the students in Memphis, which just catalyzed, right, donors in that area at the time. And so find that one champion who will go with you would be my suggestion.
I think we had another question over here.
So my name is Joe Murray. I'm an assistant dean for university advising at Florida Atlantic University. Also 2 questions. First question was on the data for FAFSA. When we've run the numbers at FAU, it is clear that one of the big roadblocks for our students is the students who are selected for verification. For us, it is absolutely not random. The students that are overwhelmingly selected are first gen, low income, and they just give up. Is there anything that are happening at the national level to look at that and say, this is not a random process, this is signaling out the students that are most at risk and adding additional barriers to that? Because we've got to change that. It is just insurmountable for those students, and they're the ones that are selected more times than not. The second question is, as you've been talking about scaling and starting small, and this just maybe I'm new to this process, but small right now seems to be single institutions, single counties. One of the things that we're starting to put together for Atlantic is a certain subpopulation of students at a single school, specifically foster youth. We're working with pulling together a community-based system for basically a promise for our foster youth on our campus, which then we're hoping to leverage to first gen, because obviously that is a subset of that. Are there any good examples or schools that you could point me to that started either with that population in particular, or just that sliver, a small group of students that then expanded from there? Thank you.
Okay, the first question, I can just give you a reference to ticas.org, TICAS.org. They look at all of the challenges of who's getting served and who's not, and why not, and they have different resources, and they have partnerships with different legal experts and so on, and also a number of the law centers also look at this, so I would just refer you to that. And if you TICAS, T-I-C-A-S, the Institute for College Access and Success. It's a .org, it's a nonprofit, and I think the VP is Debbie Cochran. She'll respond to you on that. And if you want a different answer, I can probably give you a different organization, but they do really wonderful. There's also another group called, I think it's a student protection. There's a new organization that's protecting students, and I can get that to you also. The other thing was about the foster youth. So one interesting thing, the foster youth impact at Say Yes to Education, which takes place in Buffalo, New York. And they've been in place for 6 years. They have 6 years of data. I think they've been in place longer than that. But with 6 years of data, they've had a tremendous success metric with foster youth. So while it's been part of a comprehensive, what they call a full pathway program, they have targeted foster youth. And part of what they've done is they've networked social services, the foster youth program, and the Promise Say Yes program together. So they're getting data on multiples of subsets of students. So I would refer you there. The other one is, and this is sort of separate from Promise, but UCLA has had a long history with foster youth. And since you're a university program, you might want to just check out what they've done with foster youth. Because again, I think the social services aspect and linking that in has been really the definer of really targeting that population and doing something more. So yes, there are special populations within Promise. I think looking at across all 300, most of them are broader based. They are looking at more full-time, many of them. Some of them are focused on, as I said, universal youth and adults. But you need a starting point, and that's a great population.
Do you have any other questions?
Needs service.
Hi, I'm Tom Hilliard with the New Jersey Office of the Secretary of Higher Education. And, I think one of the things that's particularly valuable for us out in the States is understanding what the levers are, what are the policies which are, at least to some extent, portable. And we can say, aha, that looks like a great idea that we could bring to our state. So as an example of that, I thought the completion grant sounded like a potentially portable thing. I have to admit, as you describe it, I didn't understand it at all. And I think that you folks may be a little bit too immersed in it and just sort of jumping into some of the process stuff. I wonder if you could step back and just draw me a diagram of how it works. Who receives the money? What do they do with it? And what partners need to be in place to make it work?
Regarding the completion grant specifically?
Yeah.
Regarding the completion grant specifically, okay. So the completion grant, and the reason the details are a bit nebulous is because, again, we are operationalizing right now, but I will tell you at kind of the 1,000-foot level how it works. And at least this is my understanding of it from Georgia State, and they have a lot of great information about their Panther retention that is, lots and lots of data, so I charge you to go look at that. But how it works is a student oftentimes either cannot enroll or cannot attend class if they have an outstanding bursar bill at the university. In Georgia, you're not allowed to attend class after a couple of weeks, I believe it's a state law. In Indiana, you can't enroll for the following semester if you have an outstanding payment. So it looks at that universe of students. That's your starting point. And then it prioritizes students that are close to completion, have a debt that's under $1,500 usually, and you can kind of change your formula so that it prioritizes high demand careers. And so you can say, we have Salesforce is in Indy, and so if they need coders, they can say, we'll fund, if you can find us 15 students that'll be out, we'll fund those grants for you. But then also it can come from just the general funding as well. And so from a partner perspective, you need the higher ed institutions. The money goes through the bursar's office to the student, pays the outstanding amount. Generally then there's some requirements on the student as far as meeting with a financial aid planner so that because it's a one-time payment, so if you have 2 semesters left, you want to ensure they've got a plan in place on how that's going to be sustainable. And that's it. It's not a merit-based, so that's also the other thing that's pretty important. It's not about priority based on GPA and highest performing student. It's really about how we've designed it, proximity to completion, and really trying to close that 90% done, 75% done student, and maybe fill that $500 gap that they've found is preventing them from continuing to enroll so that they can get across the finish line.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, my name is Jose Cabrales. I'm with AskU. And I have a question with regards to, I understand that there's different programmatic aspects to each of the Promise programs. Mayor Garcia, one of those programmatic aspects is internships with the Promise program, is to just, as part of their career, educational pathway, career is kind of injected into that. As your college programs evolve, is there any plan to include career development in your programs?
So we have, in the form of job shadowing, as I mentioned, we have that 8-hour community service requirement, and many of our students utilize that 8 hours in job shadowing. So I want to be a teacher, I spend the 8 hours in a classroom. We actually are now hosting once a semester job shadow days where we partner with businesses across the state and actually facilitate what goes on at the company. So the students do job shadowing, but we also bring them together to talk about how to write a resume and interview skills and, a proper handshake. And for many of our students, this is the only exposure they've had to those sort of soft skills that we know are so important to employability. I will also say, because of Promise coming into the fold and all the partnership that surrounds Promise, many of our communities are lifting up programs like internship programs. A lot of our colleges are doing emergency funds because they're not funding scholarships at the level that they once were. And so Chattanooga has started a program through a partnership with the mayor's office and the chamber to start a robust program specifically focused on inner city students, so that at-risk student population, trying to keep them engaged over the summer melt being a challenge in Chattanooga. So yes, it's happening in pockets, but not always organized by the Promise program, but certainly in alignment with the work that we're doing.
And I can just direct you to Chris Cabalden. He just got reelected for another 4 years as mayor of West Sacramento. He built high school and college internships into the design of the Promise. So the business community is stepping up, but in terms of a design, that is something that, my dream is that the business communities are going to give high school students, even middle school students, at least something that's a paid internship, an opportunity to shadow, and an opportunity to give back. And it's amazing to listen to a lot of the conversations where the employers will say, well, we can't do it. We can't take a high school student. Not true. We can show you where it's happened, how many years it's happened, how they're paid a stipend, and moving on. I think the big challenge for education is relevant career opportunities, relevant internships, even workplace learning opportunities that tie into academic programs so that students could get credit for what they're learning or write about those experiences. There's just all kinds of things happening in that space, and I'm excited about it.
If you have any other questions, we now know that Krissy's number is the first one on the website at tnAchieves. So feel free to give her a buzz. I'm sure she'll pick up. I would just want to thank the panel. This has been a dream come true for me to ask questions of some of the most impressive people I know. So if we all join me in thanking them for their time, and thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you later.